All right, welcome to our second video for week 3 for English 123. In this video, we're just going to briefly discuss thesis statement. What is a thesis statement? How does it function in a research paper? And how to actually formally draft or compose a formal research thesis statement for your paper. So what is a thesis statement? Well, you've probably had prior experience with thesis statements from another class, but it's really important to really understand exactly what it is and how it functions in the paper. Thesis statement is the main idea of your paper. It is the main point that you're making. It's your main argument. Now, the thesis statement has 3 specific parts to it, but its function is to provide the reader the specific argument that you're going to make, and it becomes the heart and the most important part of your entire paper. Everything in your paper should directly correlate to that thesis statement. All of your main points of support should tie back to the thesis statement. And what that does is it enables the reader to see the progression of thought through the paper and to see how everything directly supports that thesis statement, which then will enable them to fully understand your argument and then hopefully accept or at least consider your argument. It makes for a more successful argument when the thesis statement and the content that follows are all directly connected to one another. If it's not connected, then what we have is a digression in the main thought process of the argument. So then if you've established your thesis statement and then you're beginning to go through your supportive paragraphs, if you then begin to digress into a different main idea or a different idea away from the thesis statement, it can then begin to confuse the reader to where they don't really quite understand how that relates to the thesis statement. I see what you've said and what you're going to argue, and I see some of your points, but this has digressed. It doesn't really make sense as far as how that fits in with what you're really saying. It can leave the reader confused, unfortunately. So we want to avoid digression at all costs. And the way that we do that is we keep the thesis statement in the main center of focus as we write. Unfortunately, what can happen is you've crafted the thesis statement, your introductory paragraph, you've gone through with your first paragraph of support, and then as you begin to drift, you begin to forget, because then you begin to get caught up in the writing of your the composition of your paper, and you begin to forget what direction you're going, how you're going to lead the reader along to support your argument. The way you avoid that is to refer back, to always check back with your thesis statement, to check back with what you've written prior, to make sure you're leading that trail. It's kind of like Hansel and Gretel, if you know the fairy tale where they're leaving crumbs so that they know their way through the forest. It's something similar to that, where you want to have a trail of thought, a train of thought through your paper that directly connects to the thesis statement. So the function of a thesis statement really is the anchor of the paper. Another way to look at it is it's the peak, the pinnacle of the paper, and it really needs to shine. It needs to be held up, and it needs to be the main focus. So a good way to look at this is, say, perhaps the thesis statement is some type of sphere or ball, and that's sitting on some kind of maybe a column or a pillar of some sort, supporting it. So the thesis statement is the ball, and then the remaining of the paper is the supportive detail that's holding all of that up. Maybe it's similar to the Greek god Atlas. The Greek god Atlas is known for holding up the earth on his back. So Atlas is the supporting detail of your paper, and the earth is the thesis statement. So those two work together to form an effective argument that is fully supported and fully detailed. So again, we want to avoid digression. We want to avoid peripheral topics. We want to keep everything in line with the thesis statement from the beginning, the introduction, all the way to the conclusion. It should be a straight line. Another way to look at it is threading the needle through each of the paragraphs. The thesis statement is the thread, and you're weaving it through each of the needles of the paragraphs, making sure it all connects through those eyes of the needle. There's other analogies that can be used. I don't want to exhaust it, but hopefully that makes the point. So again, it's the main idea, it's the main point of your paper. It needs to be focused. The paper needs to be focused and related to that main idea, and we want to avoid digressing from that idea. And I only stress that because it is very common for vagueness and digression to creep into a research paper on an undergraduate level. It's very common. It's something that you'll need to just continuously be aware of, that each of your paragraphs are following that progression. And you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks as we get more into the drafting stage. But I wanted to make you aware of that just so you could see how the thesis statement relates to the remaining paragraphs as they begin to progress through the paper. Okay, so moving on, how do we craft a thesis statement? What's the formal academic thesis statement that we need for this paper? Well, it comes in three parts. First, there's the what, the how, and the why. And this is specific to the actual prompt for your discussion board post, and it kind of follows the equation email that I sent out last week. So the what is your claim? And it's a simple stating of your claim. I will argue X. I will argue X by demonstrating ABC as evidence because ... That's a simple way to follow a thesis statement. And that just gives the I there for, the first person is just to give you a way of relating to it. We really want to avoid first person in our actual research paper, but using I, it just kind of personalizes it right now, and it helps you to kind of think of your thesis statement as, yes, this is my argument, but when you go to actually craft your research paper, we want to avoid the first person and move more into the third person, which would be more of, this essay will argue, or this paper will argue, or one may argue. You can pose it as a probable argument for someone to have. And that just gives more credibility to your research paper, because then it disconnects you from it as an individual, and then begins to enable the reader to see the paper as itself, on its own. This research paper will argue. So it's the research paper doing the arguing, not necessarily you as the author. Even though you as the author get credit for it, it's more directed towards the paper, because then the paper becomes more of it builds the credibility for the paper, because then the experts from the sources then begin to shine through in support of your argument. Whereas if I'm saying it, then I'm the one that can be attacked. I'm the one that can be disagreed with. Then it becomes more of a personal argument rather than an argument from a paper or from a third person generalization. One may argue, well, the reader is one, and so then the reader can then put themselves in that place of the argument. So one may argue, well, I may argue that. Okay, I can consider that. That's a possibility. So that's just a slight detail that will come up later on as well. But that's a simple way to put your argument in the developmental stage, in the first person. I will argue X. And so then as this relates to the equation, as it relates to your actual discussion post, it has here, I will argue, and the example is for what? I will argue that gun ownership should be controlled. So the actual argument is gun ownership should be controlled. So then next, that you're instructed to write down how you will argue this. And this is with 3 points that you will be using to support your argument. And the example given here is through more rigorous requirements to own, passing stronger laws, and using smart gun technology. So those are 3 points that have been chosen to support the argument. They're being highlighted in the thesis statement to allow the reader to understand what's coming later in the paper. And then it is finished with a why or a because to help the reader understand the justification of the argument to keep the general population safer. So those 3 elements, the what, the how, and the why, that equation, adding those together, equal a thesis statement. So that's really a good way to look at it. That equation that I sent is something that I want you to consider and how you may see thesis statements, how you may draft them, how you may craft them. And again, I use the example of one may argue or this essay will argue. That's how you will begin to craft it as your drafting stages take place, and then your final draft should have that third person. Another thing that can be added here is a therefore or a conclusion statement. And you'll see how this works. Therefore, one may argue that gun ownership should be controlled through more rigorous requirements to own, passing stronger laws, and using smart gun technology to keep the general population safer. Now that's a formal academic research thesis statement for your paper. So the therefore acts as a conclusion statement for the thesis statement because the thesis statement itself serves as a conclusion to the introduction paragraph. So as you've crafted your introduction paragraph, say you've begun general introduction, broad, and you've narrowed down more specific in your introductory details, you then come to the thesis statement, which is a conclusion of that information. So the thesis statement then becomes an answer to the question or the research problem that you've discussed in the introduction. So then it can be dealt with as a conclusion. Therefore, this essay will argue. Therefore, one may argue. Therefore, I will argue. So those are your options. That's how you can begin to develop your thesis statement. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know and I can help you through that. But it's very simple to follow that formula. It'll help you really craft a strong thesis statement that's effective in supporting your claim. And we're going to go ahead and end it there. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And certainly appreciate your time. You have a great night and a great day. Thank you.